About what we covered last time before we get started, because we stopped at this sort of complicated bit. But we sort of finished last time talking about the thyroid gland in general. And in order to really understand what this gland does, we have to sort of look in a cell, in one of the thyroid gland cells, and see its process.
Thank you so much.
And like I said last time, this is a great example of how your book really takes a lot of information and puts it in a very small space. But that doesn't mean that there is less information. It is just more briefly said. You know what I mean? So you have to take your time with diagrams like this. All right, so here is a thyroid gland cell. And they thyroid gland cells surround these areas of sort of glassy, like protein storage called thyroid follicles. And in that follicle, as I said last time, is stored up thyroid hormone, which we're going to talk a lot more about here in just a minute. Okay, so there's that cell. Here's the capillary, so that's representative of the blood supply. So things going to and from the thyroid gland are going to arrive via the capillaries. And this whole process starts right here with a TSH-sensitive ion pump. Well, this is circle, highlight, arrow worthy for sure. Because remember, TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, is the hormone the pituitary releases as a way to stimulate the thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormone. Now, this is not the only thing that TSH does. In fact, we don't know all the things that TSH does at the thyroid gland, but we know about this one. And that is, this ion pump is selective for iodide. Remember we talked last time about how iodide is found principally in seawater, and therefore it's found in seafood. So fish, for example, from ocean fish anyway, has a relatively high amount of iodide. That is the natural human source of iodide in our diet, is seafood. And we talked about how it's now added to salt in the inland regions. Well, here in the United States, it's the whole country. But anyway, that iodide is found in tiny, tiny little amounts in the body, in the blood. The only organ we know of that actually uses iodide for anything is the thyroid gland. And what it uses it for is it's a key component to T3 and T4, which are the thyroid hormones. So no iodide, no thyroid hormone, because you can't make it without it. Well, since the thyroid gland is the principal user of iodide, it has this pump that pumps iodide from the blood into the thyroid gland cells. And when TSH is high, this pump works faster. When TSH is low, this pump works slower. So one of the ways the pituitary controls thyroid gland function is by controlling how rapidly iodide is brought into the cell. More iodide in, more hormone production, because iodide is the rate-limiting step of thyroid hormone production. So you remember from chemistry, I hope, the rate-limiting step is the reaction that is the slowest, right, in a series of reactions. Well, in this case, the rate at which iodide can be pumped in is the rate-limiting step. All right, so what happens next? Well, the iodide diffuses across the cell, and in some complicated biochemistry that we're not going to talk about, it is added to tyrosine and some other amino acids to form what is called thyroglobulin. And thyroglobulin contains iodide, and it's pumped out into this follicle cavity right here. And in the follicle cavity, it's stored. So what is thyroglobulin? It is T3 and T4 kind of jammed together and attached to some proteins to make it ultra-stable, okay? And we'll talk in a minute. T3 and T4 are the active hormones that the thyroid gland makes. Thyroglobulin, though, is not active. It doesn't do anything. If you took it out of the follicle cavity and you injected it in somebody, it wouldn't do anything. It would just circulate around the body until it was broken down. So this stored up thyroid hormone called thyroglobulin, it sits there until the body needs, or the thyroid gland needs to secrete more hormone. Then it's taken back in to the same cells, this time by endocytosis. Remember, that's the process by which cells sort of pinch off a little of their external environment and bring it in. Well, it comes into the cell that, and then in this phagosome here, the result of the endocytosis, the thyroglobulin is now broken into its T4 and T3 parts. Then the T4 and T3 diffuse out into the bloodstream. T4 and T3 are what get things done in the body. So all cells in the body have receptors for T4 and T3, the thyroid hormones. They have them on their mitochondria, they have them in their nucleus, and some cells have them on their receptor membrane as well. So first it's made into this complicated protein-like structure. Then it's taken back into the cell, broken down. The amino acids are recycled so that it can be used again, but the T4 and T3 are released into the blood. Now, T4 and T3 are sort of weird molecules. We're not going to talk about their molecular structure, but they don't dissolve in water very well. In some ways, they're a little bit like a lipid. They're not really a lipid, but they act like a lipid. Which means if we're going to carry T4 and T3, or if we're going to get T4 and T3 out to the cells of the body, we're going to have to attach it to something that is water soluble. So T4 and T3 have these little carrier proteins in the blood that we call thyroid binding globulins. So a globulin is just a protein that doesn't really do very much, but has a complicated shape. You know, like a glob of something is a relatively complicated three-dimensional structure. So a globulin has a complicated structure, and in this case, that structure means it has these slots, so to speak, to hold T4 and T3. So T4 and T3 circulate in the blood, and eventually they diffuse out of the capillaries and into the target cells. Okay? So the T4 and T3 are not equally distributed. So typically there's more T4 than T3, and depending on the cell, they have slightly different effects, but that is a much more detailed conversation that we're going to have. For our purposes, thyroid hormone is T4 and T3, and they both have the same effects on cells. Okay, that's you'll learn more about the details when you talk about endocrinology in your master's level programs. All right. So about 25 to 30% of the T4 and T3 is bound to these carrier proteins. The other 25 to 30% is actually free in the plasma. So it's sort of a balance there. Okay. And you note here, one of the last statements is the bloodstream itself, so the circulating blood volume, carries about a week's supply of thyroid hormone all by itself. So if your thyroid gland shut down, you'd be fine for about a week because of all the T4 and T3 that's circulating anyway. Okay, so there's a broad safety margin, so to speak, because we talked last time about how you have to have T4 and T3 to live, so the body keeps plenty around in the bloodstream just in case. Okay. So, a little synopsis here. The hormones are produced here, right? Stored here, and then released into the circulation. And TSH regulates that process by controlling this pump at the beginning. Now, TSH actually plays a role on this side of the process too, but your book doesn't talk about that. So we'll leave that for another day. Okay. So thyroid hormone and thyroid function. All right, so what exactly do thyroid hormones do? Well, they play a major role in metabolism. And what I mean by that, metabolism is all the chemical reactions happening in the body at any given time. And some big proportion of those reactions have to do with our use of energy, right? Formation of ATP and destruction of ATP to do stuff, whether it's to move skeletal muscle, make complicated molecules, whatever. So one of the effects of thyroid hormone is to increase oxygen consumption. Now, how does that make sense? If you stimulate the mitochondria are the reason we need oxygen to live, right? Because the mitochondria use oxygen to produce ATP in huge amounts by creating CO2 and water in the end. So if you stimulate the mitochondria, your oxygen consumption is going to go up, as is your energy consumption. Your calories burned are going to go up under the influence of thyroid hormone. And body temperature is also affected. So it says in children, but the truth is even in adults, thyroid hormone causes an increase in body temperature if it's in excess anyway. So we have that. In the cardiovascular system, thyroid hormone supports the heart's function. So it encourages strong heartbeats. It encourages good solid blood pressure because of good strong contraction. So there again, one of the things that happens in the absence of thyroid hormone is the heart does not keep up with the body's needs. So it beats too weakly and it doesn't beat fast enough to maintain circulation. Okay? And a rise in blood pressure will happen if you gave somebody an injection of thyroid hormone over what normal, their blood pressure would go up because their heart rate would go up and their contraction strength would go up too. The thyroid hormone and the sympathetic nervous system from last semester, they work as a team. So the fight or flight system doesn't work properly if there's not adequate thyroid hormone around. So you have to have one to have the other. And if there is thyroid hormone but no sympathetic nervous system stimulation, you get a similar effect. You have to have both to have that sympathetic nervous system work properly. And at the end of next time, we're going to take that sympathetic nervous system piece, the fight or flight response, and we're going to finish talking about the rest of what happens in a survival scenario like that. So we'll talk a little bit more about thyroid hormone then. All right. The respiratory system is also dependent upon thyroid hormone to function properly. When your thyroid levels are very, very low, you don't breathe adequately, and you have poor oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange at the lungs, right? So these are big things. You know, energy consumption, heart rate, cardiovascular system need that to survive, right? Respiratory system need that. Sympathetic system need that to survive any kind of challenge anyway. So you're starting to see a pattern, hopefully, that thyroid gland is one of the more important hormones of the body, which we talked a little bit about last time too. And even in the long term, in order to have thyroid, in order to have normal red blood cell production, again, you have to have thyroid around, and the thyroid hormones stimulate all the other endocrine organs as well. So, for example, in the pancreas, which produces insulin to control blood sugar, without thyroid hormone present, insulin production decreases, and you literally, the cells start to starve for oxygen because the blood glucose is not being maintained. So thyroid hormone does all kinds of things. Oh, the last one is bone. In order to have strong bones, you have to have stable and normal thyroid function as well. So in patients with long-term hypothyroidism, their thyroid gland doesn't produce enough hormone, you get a combination of all of these different effects in inverse, right? So you have patients whose oxygen and respiratory status is low, their cardiovascular system is weak, their bones are fragile, the rest of their endocrine system is depressed, and overall these are patients who are very, very brittle. So somebody who has long-standing untreated hypothyroidism is very likely to, in the slightest little illness, they'll collapse. They'll have what's called a stress collapse because they don't have any reserve. So they get very sick very quickly. Yeah?
Is this all the same for other animals too, or just humans?
It is. It is. Thyroid gland, at least for all the mammals. I'm not sure about reptiles and birds. But yes, all mammals have this thyroid dependency. Yeah. All right. Okay, good. So thyroid gland, probably the most important gland that we talk about in this section. You know, the pituitary and hypothalamus, they're all about control, right? The brain's control over the rest of the body's chemical messaging systems. But the thyroid gland is a major player in every cell of the body and its energy uses. So worth knowing some things about. Okay. If we take the thyroid gland here and we take it away from the trachea, because remember, This is sort of the anatomy. This is the front, right? And I told you it wrapped around the trachea. Well, if we take it off and we flip it around, we see these four little ovoid shapes that look a little bit different. Now, this is totally artist rendering. If you actually did this with a thyroid gland and you turned it around and looked at it, these four spots would not look any different than the rest, all right? And these glands are some of the most recently discovered. So as late as the 1920s, we didn't know parathyroid glands existed, okay, because they look just like the rest of the thyroid tissue, and nobody had taken the time at that point to get under the microscope and look at section by section of thyroid tissue. Now we know they do exist, mostly because of surgery's gone bad, but the parathyroid glands sit inside the thyroid, but they do something totally different, and that is they control calcium homeostasis. The parathyroid glands, four of them, superior and inferior and a left and right, they produce a hormone called parathyroid hormone, not surprisingly, and parathyroid hormone's job is to increase circulating calcium levels in the body, okay? So you said last time that you didn't really talk about calcium homeostasis in the past, but calcium, because we have calcium in our bones, calcium homeostasis works a little differently than other minerals. So we have in, right, out, and bones and blood. Okay. So we're talking about this calcium. So there's calcium in our diet, which means there's calcium coming into our bodies every day. And, you know, we all know that there's lots of calcium in dairy products, but there's lots of calcium in lots of other things too. You know, calcium has been around in, you know, living things for a long, long time evolutionarily. So you find a small amount of calcium in just about everything we eat, plants and animals too. So we have dietary calcium in, and then every day we lose some calcium in the kidneys, right? Well, in the middle, we have two places we find calcium in the body. It's either locked up in the bones, because bones are calcium crystals. So, you know, we all have about between 1.5 and 2 kilograms of elemental calcium locked up in our bones all the time. So that's a lot. You know, that is a big, heavy bucket of calcium, elemental calcium. So that's where most of the calcium in our body is. But the calcium locked up in the bones can't participate in cellular metabolism, right? Because it's locked up in the bones. It's not circulating. So some of the calcium in the body is circulating in the blood as calcium ion, right? So Ca++. And the calcium level in the blood, this part, has to be stable. So we're going to say it has to be stable. So this has to stay the same, even though this changes day to day, and this changes day to day. So if this has to be the same and these two things are changing, there has to be a system for controlling the bone, the amount of calcium in the bones, blood, and how much is coming out of the kidneys. And there's two players in this stability, right? There's PTH and calcitonin. Calcitonin is produced in those other kind of cells in the thyroid gland we talked about last time. The C cells, the clear cells, they produce calcitonin, and calcitonin causes a decrease in blood calcium. So if I give you calcitonin, your calcium level decreases. Well, where does it go? Well, when calcitonin is around, calcium moves from blood to bone. So this is in response to calcitonin. And calcitonin causes an increase in calcium excretion. Okay? So you lock it up in the bones. Good idea, because calcium is always going to be important. But in the short term, we get rid of excess the calcium that's too high by dumping it out of the kidneys. Now the other player is parathyroid hormone, and it does the opposite. So it increases calcium in the blood, and it does that by stealing it from the bones. So this is parathyroid hormone. And parathyroid hormone causes a decrease in calcium excretion. Okay. So now we can account for both problems. So let's say, you get concerned that you're going to have brittle bones when you get older, and you start taking 4 calcium supplements a day, right? You're taking 2 grams of calcium a day. Well, initially, your calcium level in your blood is going to go up because it comes in through the digestive tract, goes into the blood. The response to that will be calcitonin will be released, and that will cause that excess calcium to get locked into the bones and to be excreted in the kidney. Now, if you do the opposite, low calcium diet, why would anybody do that? But imagine. If you have a low calcium diet, your calcium in the blood goes down. That causes parathyroid hormone to be released, and that steals calcium from the bones and decreases calcium excretion, so your calcium levels stay the same. Okay? So 2 major players, they work in opposite directions. So calcitonin, I remember it is tones down calcium, old mnemonic. So it turns the calcium level down, and parathyroid hormone does the opposite, increases calcium levels. All right. So the only other player in the calcium homeostasis is vitamin D. Okay. And you've all heard of vitamin D. Vitamin D's role is right here, really. So we'll say vitamin D. When vitamin D is present, we absorb calcium from our food much better than when it's absent. So no vitamin D, very poor calcium absorption, which oftentimes leads to a decrease in calcium levels and an increase in parathyroid hormone levels. So this piece right here is one of the players in osteoporosis, just to connect it to something clinical. So if you have inadequate dietary calcium, well, the response of the body is to release parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone steals calcium from the bones to keep the blood calcium stable, because you need that to live, right? So over the long term, the bones have less and less calcium. They get thinner and thinner and more brittle, right? So one of the treatments or preventions for osteoporosis, that's brittle bone disease that old people get, right, is number 1, make sure people have plenty of calcium in their diet. Number 2, make sure they have plenty of vitamin D so they can actually get that calcium out of their food. And in extreme cases, like in the elderly, where you're trying to re-strengthen bones that have gotten weak, we give them calcitonin-like substances that push calcium into the bones and cause the bones to get harder and more solid with more calcium in it. So some of those new treatments, you hear about them on the TV sometimes, 1 infusion a year or 1 infusion every month or every 6 months. Those are calcitonin analogs that take the calcium in your diet and push it into the bones. All right. So a little bit about calcium homeostasis. And remember, calcium is necessary for nerves to function, muscle to function, and most glands to function. So no calcium, not going to be alive for very long. Yeah.
Okay, so the parathyroid gland produces the parathyroid hormone.
Correct.
How does it know if the calcium levels are low in the blood?
It has sensors for that. So the parathyroid hormone senses calcium change.
So it senses the blood going through itself?
Yes,
Oh,
yes.
Okay.
It sort of has like a calcium meter in the blood.
Okay.
So the parathyroid hormone, or the parathyroid glands, when it senses calcium levels decreasing, it increases its production.
Got it.
Right. Because unlike many of these other hormones, this is not under the control of the pituitary. So it controls itself. Does that kind of make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So do the C cells of the thyroid. They're not under control of the hypothalamus and pituitary. They're watching calcium levels all the time. Very good question. Yes.
So when they take out part of the thyroid due to like the overactive thyroid, they don't take out the parathyroid gland?
That
or they
is
do?
a change. It used to be when they went to take out the thyroid, they didn't know these existed, right? So they would just take a whack out, and then they would, why are your calcium levels so low? So now they work around them. And the most common way to deal with too much thyroid activity is to give radioactive iodine. Because that iodine is absorbed into just the thyroid gland, and the cells die from the radiation. So instead of going in with a knife and cutting it out, it's like killing it with the radiation instead. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
That's the most common way it's dealt with now. Yes?
Is that just like an injection? Or?
Yeah, it's an injection. You're radioactive for a couple of days. And it sequesters in the thyroid gland because it's the only place that takes up iodine.
Would it like hurt?
No, it doesn't hurt. I mean, it causes some inflammation, so your neck is a little sore.
How do you make sure that you go around the parathyroid gland?
Well, the parathyroid glands don't absorb iodine, so they're saved automatically. It's one of the ways. It's one of the reasons they do it that way. The only downside is you can't. It's difficult to carefully control how much you destroy. So a lot of times they destroy a little much, and then you have to put thyroid hormone back in with medicine. Yeah. You have somebody.
Yeah, so is too much calcium a problem since it just kind of goes to the bones anyway? Like, is that dangerous?
Too much calcium, the only problem that we can resolve is this part. If your calcium levels are high, calcitonin is released. If you get calcium excretion, that can cause kidney stones in some people. So that's the only downside. So in patients that have a history of kidney stones, you're having to walk a tightrope, because you want to have enough to keep the bones healthy, but not so much that they're putting calcium in their urine. Yeah, good question. Others?
Is it true that I've heard this lately that like drinking like cow's milk is actually bad for your bones because it sucks the calcium out and you can get it out? Because like I heard like it's the way it's like digested in your body somehow it makes like a sulfuric like
Because of the acid.
The bone. Yeah, the acid.
I don't think that's been proven.
Okay.
I mean, you do if you're gonna drink milk, you do have to have plenty of vitamin D around. But it's not that it'll leach it out of you; it just will never go in. It just goes right on out. But I haven't heard that. I mean, it could be. There's a lot of movement. We're the only animals in the animal kingdom that drink milk other than our own and after infancy. So there's some question as to whether that is really good for us or not, and that's probably where that research is coming from.
Okay, so in high school I watched a throat specialist, so she did like some thyroid surgeries, and she would like take it out, but she would like see, she would try to make sure she was getting some of the parathyroid glands still there.
Right.
And so like,
You don't need much.
Right, and so she would like, she was looking for it, and then she would like take some and like send it to the lab. Is that like one of the only ways you can tell?
Yes.
I know she also
This
would
is
put it
how
in-
this is one of the only ways you can tell. This is what parathyroid hormone tissue looks like. This is what thyroid gland tissue looks like. Do you see that? Or I'm sorry, this is what thyroid gland tissue looks like. Here. These are those follicles. See how this looks different than this?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's why she's sending it for a frozen section.
She also put it in like some like saline solution or something, like not saline solution, but like water or something. And she said that parathyroid tissue like sinks. I think it is.
Oh yeah, it probably does because it's a solid gland where these are open, and what's in here is water soluble.
I was just curious if
That's
that was
interesting.
like the only way she could like make sure she was.
The only true way is to look at it on the microscope, and a good pathologist can obviously tell the difference, between here and here. So what she'll do is she would send the margin. So like say she took this section out. The pathologist would go to the edge and see, does it look like this, in which case she's gone into the parathyroid, or does it all look like this, in which case she's still in the middle of the thyroid gland. Yeah, they do that kind of thing in cancer surgery too, where they'll send sections to the lab to see if they're at the edge of the cancer or not. Yeah, good experience. That's cool. Other questions? All right. Okay, we kind of already covered this. So we saw a few of these homeostasis diagrams last semester. Get used to them. We're going to see a bunch of them this semester. Okay. What they show you is homeostasis and the way the body maintains that. So they usually start with, the big purple circle, right? And then there's a derangement. So something happens and this, or something happens and this. And then it will show you the body's response, what that causes, and then how that restores homeostasis by balancing the initiating event. Okay, so for example, we're sitting here at normal, we take in a bunch of extra calcium, so the calcium level in the blood goes up. The thyroid gland, the C cells sense that, and they release calcitonin, which does what my very messy diagram from this angle says it does, which is to decrease blood calcium levels by sticking it in the bones and sending it up into the urine, right? So those things cause a decrease, and now we're back to homeostasis again. Okay, so essentially I talked about this over there. I think that's all of those things. And how does the calcium get in and out of bones? Unfortunately, I guess you guys didn't really get that last semester, but essentially bones have two kinds of cells inside them. They have osteoclasts and osteoblasts. Okay, blast cells make things. Clast cells destroy things. So blast and clast, we're going to see those terms in other cells. Osteo is bone. Okay, so osteoblasts are bone-making cells. Osteoclasts are bone-destroying cells. So when the calcium level is too high, like in the case of parathyroid hormone, no, sorry, let me fix that over there. It's not that it's wrong, but I just didn't say something. When calcium levels are too low, so we'll say when, right? Then that's an arrow. Then that happens. When calcium levels are too high, that happens. Okay, just to give you the trigger. Sorry I didn't put that up there before. So how does this part work? So osteoclasts. We'll say break bone. At the molecular, at the cellular level. And that causes an increase in blood calcium. Osteoblasts make bone, which causes a decrease in blood calcium. Okay. So those are the two players. So when parathyroid hormone is increasing calcium levels, it's one of the ways it's doing that is by stimulating osteoclasts to break bone down and release the calcium. Calcitonin does the opposite. It stimulates osteoblasts to make bone, and that decreases blood calcium levels. So in all of this all the time, bone is being made and bone is being dissolved. So none of your bones are as old as you are, because they're constantly being replaced, right? So all of the calcium in your bones is being turned over and made into new bone all the time. It's one of the things that makes bone so much better than like metal or ceramic like we use in surgery, is because bone is always being replaced. So it's like it's always new, where metal or ceramic wears out. Yeah.
So why do they say that, like, for women, especially in their early 20s, that's like the time to like consume calcium, because it'll affect like whether you get osteoporosis
Yes.
later or not?
It's because in your early reproductive years, that is when calcium is best put into the bones, because there's more players than this. One of the players in bone strength and growth is estrogen and progesterone in women, testosterone in men. So yes. The other piece to bone, which I'm too bad we can't just go back and talk about bone, but we can't, is bones are adaptive. So the more stress you put on a bone, the heavier and stronger that bone gets. So it isn't just calcium intake that prevents osteoporosis, it's also weight-bearing exercise. So, sometimes impact exercise gets a bad rap because it's hard on the joints. Yes, it's hard on the joints, but it's great for the bones. So runners and repetitive shock to bone actually strengthens bone, and that goes with you your whole life. Yeah.
So if you like break a bone, or if you have like a prosthetic leg or something, does that upset that whole cycle, or does it just adapt to it?
It adapts to it. So if there's a broken bone in that region, the osteoblasts take over, and they repair the bone by making new bone.
So you don't need like a supplement, like calcium supplement?
It doesn't hurt. You want to be, if you've got a broken bone or a patient with a broken bone, definitely they should get enough calcium in their diet, calcium and vitamin D, because they are going to have to repair that break.
If you have like a whole prosthetic leg, wouldn't that make like your whole body calcium levels like messed up?
No, because you lost tissue. You lost soft tissue along with the bone.
Oh.
Yeah. We could live with a lot less bone than we have. That one doesn't come up, although it's an interesting idea. Yeah. Good. Yeah.
So like how long would it take for, I know it depends on the bone, but like say your radius to renew itself? Like years or?
Years, couple 2-3 years probably. So there's probably no bone crystal that's more than 5 years old in your body. Yeah. It's kind of interesting that it's turning over like that all the time. People used to think that bone was like this dead material that muscle was attached to. But now we know that bone has this whole life of its own, and bone needs a huge blood supply to survive. So like when you look at, you remember the holes in the bones that you saw in lab and how some of them were good sized? It's because you need a bunch of arterial blood flow to keep all the bone stuff happening all the time. All right, good. Calcium homeostasis. And a little touch on bones. Maybe if we have some extra time at some point, we'll do I'll show you some pictures of bone structure and how it works. It's cool stuff. Okay, onward to our next gland. So from the neck, now we go down into the flanks. Okay, so the kidneys, oftentimes people will point to their sides, but the kidneys are really in the back. They sit just underneath your lower ribs on both sides. So they're way back there. And they exist there, as we'll talk about in the kidney chapter, because they're very protected back there. Yes, we can live without a kidney, but no, we can't live without both of them. So, if kidneys can be damaged by impact, trauma, injury, so having them in a nice protected spot is a good thing. And the adrenal glands then, which sit on top of the kidneys, like little top hats, right? They also are in that very protected region, okay? And there's one on each side, very basic gland structure. It really is kind of conical. This looks like a triangle, but just like a party hat is a cone, the adrenal glands are cone-shaped, and they sit on the top of the kidney. Just like the thyroid gland, we have this really robust blood supply. See, so we've got all these arteries going into this little tiny bit of tissue. And that's to push blood through it so that it can dump its hormones into there and affect things. Now, in the sympathetic nervous system chapter, we talked about the medulla of the adrenal gland, the center part, and how it makes epi and norepi. Easy gland to draw, right? Easy structure, nice triangle. So we have an outer point, or an outer layer. That's the cortex. Cortex just means outer layer. The inner layer is medulla. And the medulla makes norepi and epi for the sympathetic nervous system. Old news. We heard all about that already. Well, what we talk about in this chapter is, okay, well, what does the cortex make? Well, the cortex, quite a bit more complicated than the medulla. It makes a bunch of stuff. And it is divided into layers. Okay, so starting at the top, or the outermost, starting at the outermost and working our way in, the first layer we see is the zona glomerulosa. Say that slow, right? Zona glomerulosa. And the zona glomerulosa, when you look at it under the microscope, it's sort of dense and purple compared to the next layer down, right? Well, it produces what are called the mineralocorticoids. Particularly the one I want you to know is aldosterone, okay? Aldosterone, well, let's take this word apart. Corticoid means a substance that comes from a cortex. In this case, the adrenal cortex. Mineralo is mineral. Well, what's a mineral? A mineral is a non-organic compound dissolved in water. Okay, so you go to the lake, river, or stream, or even your tap at home, and you scoop up some water. Well, there's lots more in there than H2O. Okay, there's a lot of ions in there too. You know, calcium carbonate, sodium, potassium, chloride, all kinds of things. Well, the mineralocorticoids regulate the body's minerals, which are principally sodium and potassium. Okay, sodium and potassium are the principal minerals. We're going to spend a whole lecture and a half talking about them later on. But for now, those are the minerals. And they have to be controlled. You know, you learn in the nervous system and the muscle system how important sodium and potassium levels are, right? That diffusion gradient, action potentials, membrane potentials, all that cool stuff. So if sodium levels and potassium levels aren't where they should be, you have problems. So there's a hormone for that, and that hormone is aldosterone. So we're going to talk a lot about aldosterone in the kidney chapter. But for today, here I go under the screen again. Aldosterone does two things. It causes sodium retention and potassium secretion. Okay? So it regulates sodium and potassium by controlling those two things. We'll talk about the details when we get to the urinary system chapter. Okay, so because there is 4 different kinds of hormones that come out of the adrenal gland, you need a good mnemonic, right? So it's the 4 S's. Salt, sugar, sex, and sympathetic. Okay? Salt is the outermost one because minerals are salts. Sodium is a salt, potassium is a salt. So aldosterone, which comes from the outermost layer, controls sodium and potassium levels in the body. Okay, so that's the salt. The next layer down, the zona fasciculata, produces glucocorticoids. Okay, a corticoid is a substance that comes from a cortex, right? And gluco is short for glucose, which is the body's fundamental sugar. Okay, so the glucocorticoids work with insulin and glucagon, that we'll talk about next time, to control blood sugar levels, among other things. Now, that's the most obvious thing they do. At the end of next time, we're going to talk about some of the other cool things they do. But this whole section produces the glucocorticoids. Now, the more common name for this group of substances are called steroid hormones. Okay, so when you talk about people injecting steroids or pumping steroids to build muscle, well, they're probably using one of these glucocorticoids. Because in addition to raising blood sugar, they also encourage the development of muscle tissue as well as bone tissue. So the 3 main ones that we talk about are cortisol, corticosteroid, and cortisone. And you should recognize those 3, okay? Because when you get to your taking care of patients classes, you're going to see that we give people cortisol, we give people corticosteroid, and we give people cortisone. So not only are they substances the body makes, but they're also medications.
So it's like cortisone shots? Like
Cortisone shots, yep. Hydrocortisone that you put on your insect bites when they're real itchy, same stuff. Yeah. One of the most commonly prescribed medications in the world are the corticosteroids, and they have some of the worst side effects of all the medications in the world too, because they cause things like weight gain. Well, we'll get into that later. They cause a whole variety of side effects. But they come from the zona fasciculata from the adrenal cortex. All right. And then the last one, the zona reticularis down here, it's even more dense and purple than the zona glomerulosa up here, right? Can you see the difference there? And then the rest of this picture down here is the medulla, which that's norepinephrine, okay? So the zona reticularis is kind of the least important usually, but sometimes very important in rare cases. But anyway, this layer produces what are the sex hormones. That's androgens and estrogens and progesterones, okay? So in the male, the principal source of testosterone is the testes. In the female, the principal source of progesterone and estrogen are the ovaries. But in both genders, they have the opposite gender's hormones in small amounts. And this layer of the cortex is where they come from. So the estrogens and progesterones that are found in tiny little amounts in males come from the zona reticularis. And the small amount of androgens that are found in females also come from this zona reticularis. Now, usually doesn't matter, but in certain disorders where the gonads are either not formed properly or are not being controlled properly by the pituitary, this layer can do some weird things. So, for example, in a female whose ovaries do not produce enough estrogen, oftentimes the small amount of testosterone produced here can make that female child more masculine at birth. In other words, with more male-looking genitalia, for example. So we'll talk more about some of those weird, gender and genetic disorders at another time. But just for now, the zona reticularis produces sex hormones, usually for the other gender's hormones in very small amounts. Okay? All right. And then the medulla we already talked about. Questions about any of that stuff? A lot of information here, okay? Right? So salt, that's aldosterone. Sugar, the glucocorticoids. And sex, the androgens, estrogens, progesterones that are found in the other gender. Okay. A little time to talk about the pancreas. So the pancreas really appears in two organ systems. It appears in the digestive tract and in the endocrine system. Most of the pancreas is a digestive tract organ. It produces digestive enzymes that break down proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. More on that in another chapter. The 1%, though, is significant, and that is their endocrine production. And there's 4 hormones, of which 2 are really important. So glucagon, insulin, growth hormone, inhibiting hormone, and pancreatic polypeptide are all made in what are called the pancreatic islets. So here's what an islet looks like. This purple tissue out here, this is what most of the pancreas looks like. But scattered around the pancreas, there are these islets, like a small island is an islet. That's how it gets its name. These islets have cells and structure that look very different than their surroundings, and it's because they do a different thing, and that is they produce these blood sugar controlling hormones. Okay, so the alpha cells, which are in yellow, okay, they make glucagon. The beta cells, which are in the salmon color, they make insulin. And then the delta cells, which are this deep red color, make growth hormone, inhibiting hormone. And then the F cells, which are these blue ones, produce pancreatic polypeptide. All right, so the only 2 that we're going to really talk about in this class are glucagon and insulin. And I'll give you a little preview, and we'll pick up on it next time. Glucagon increases blood sugar levels. Insulin decreases blood sugar levels, glucose levels, okay? Now, the other 2, growth hormone inhibiting factor is the same thing, or inhibiting hormone, is the same substance the hypothalamus produces. Remember in the growth hormone list, there was an inhibiting factor and a stimulating factor? It turns out the pancreas produces an inhibiting factor too, and that is to help slow down the metabolism of nutrients that are coming into the digestive tract. And then the pancreatic polypeptide is the new one on the block, relatively recently discovered, and it controls some digestive system function, and it's more of a digestive tract hormone than an endocrine chapter or an endocrine system hormone. So we'll talk about blood glucose next time. And once again, I'm sorry we didn't get any questions. I need to put more questions in here. Part of it is you guys ask great questions. I love this group. I've never had more questions in class, so I love it. It means you're thinking and you're making connections, which is what this is all about. So keep it up. All right. We're out of time, but if anybody have other questions? Yeah.
Okay, I just want to make sure I got this right. You don't have
Yes, break down hormones.
So they're I just wasn't sure. And then you're right, I'm much better.
Right, because calcium is locked up here, so the blood level goes down.
I mean, for the whole thing the other day, steroids are lipid soluble. They have got
Right. Yes. Anything that's lipid soluble distributes to all the bodies water because it can pass through the cells. So yes, steroid use you can detect for months afterwards.
Oh, for months. Wow.
Yes, because it distributes in all the body cells. It's similar to THC metabolites, like your drug testing for marijuana. They're lipid soluble too, so they end up distributed in all the body's water cells. You test much later.
But I guess it's why you get to like your
That's a little different because you're detecting, it's
not moved.
it's a placental hormone that you're detecting. It's a water cycle. But we're going to talk about that.
I was just thinking.
Well, remember, I thought we were going to find, I thought we were going to go in, either bring our dinner in